All right, let's dive right into this. We're talking about a massive, multi-million-dollar settlement, one that was supposed to be a big win for victims of predatory lending. But, and this is a big but, the very groups that exist to fight for these victims, they're now fighting tooth and nail to stop the whole deal. I mean, how does that even happen? Can a deal designed to help victims actually end up hurting them more? It's a pretty wild question, and it's really the core of this whole story. We're going to unpack how a solution meant for thousands of families could, as critics are saying, put them in even more danger. So, what's really going on? Well, you've got this powerful coalition. I'm talking fair housing groups, immigrant advocacy groups, and they are in federal court, telling the judge, you have to reject this settlement. It involves a huge Texas developer named Colony Ridge, and their whole argument is that this deal, the one that's supposed to fix things, they say it actually makes everything a whole lot worse. And we're not just talking about a squabble over the dollar amount. The specific legal language they're using is critical here. These groups are claiming that key parts of this agreement are, and I'm quoting, unlawful, unnecessary, and unrelated to the underlying case. I mean, that's a huge accusation. They're basically saying the deal is legally broken and totally misses the point. So, yeah, let's take a look at what's actually in this thing. Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this $68 million deal. We need to break down the proposed agreement, which is between the developer, Colony Ridge, on one side, and two big federal agencies, the Department of Justice and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, on the other. So, the big headline number is $68 million. And look, on the surface, that sounds pretty impressive, right? A huge penalty, a major win for consumers. But you know how it goes. The devil is always in the details, especially when it comes to where all that money is actually supposed to end up. Right, so the biggest slice of the pie, a whopping $48 million, is set aside for infrastructure improvements. We're talking things like better roads, utilities, public services for the community, stuff that's genuinely needed. But that still leaves another $20 million unaccounted for. And here it is. This is the part that has everyone up in arms. That remaining $20 million, it's designated for immigration-related law enforcement. Let that sink in for a second. Money from a settlement about predatory lending is going to be used for immigration enforcement. This is the single provision that has set off alarm bells for advocates everywhere. Now, to fully understand why that's so explosive, we've got to hit rewind and go back to the lawsuit that started this whole thing. Why exactly did Colony Ridge get sued in the first place? So this all kicked off in December of 2023. That's when the DOJ and the CFPB teamed up and filed a lawsuit against Colony Ridge. And the heat didn't stop there. Just a little while later, in 2024, the Texas Attorney General jumped in with a similar lawsuit. So you can see the pressure was really starting to build. And the allegations they laid out were, frankly, pretty shocking. The government accused Colony Ridge of a whole pattern of predatory behavior that was specifically aimed at Hispanic borrowers. They claimed the company was running an illegal land sale scheme, making false statements to thousands of people about major things, like, say, flood risks, and that they were saddling families with abusive loans without even bothering to check if they could actually afford to pay them back. All of this, they said, was a violation of two major federal laws, the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's circle back to why these groups are so opposed to this deal. When you know that the company was specifically accused of targeting Hispanic borrowers, well, you can probably start to see why a plan to use the settlement money for immigration enforcement might be just a little bit of a problem. Really, this whole conflict boils down to two totally different ways of looking at the same deal. The government's position is, hey, we're resolving predatory lending claims and implementing new, fair standards. But the critics look at the same agreement and see something terrifying. They say it subjects the very victims of the scheme to more surveillance and a higher risk of deportation. And maybe most importantly, they point out a glaring omission. The deal provides absolutely zero direct financial relief to the actual people who were harmed. And that point is really hammered home by this quote from Mitria Spotzer, who's with the Center for Responsible Lending. She says, "The proposed agreement does not compensate the people or communities that were harmed by the predatory policies and actions of this developer." Just think about that. The people who lost their savings, who were tricked into terrible loans, maybe even lost their land, they don't see a single dime of this money. And if that wasn't enough, this next quote from Odette Williamson at the National Consumer Law Center makes the argument even more pointed. She says money that should go to victims is instead being proposed for immigration enforcement, subjecting victims to increased risk of deportation. I mean, that is a truly stunning accusation. The idea that a settlement meant to bring justice is instead being used to create fear and actively endanger the very same people it's supposed to help. And you need to understand, this isn't some small group of activists. The coalition fighting this deal is a who's who of major civil rights and consumer protection organizations. We're talking about the National Fair Housing Alliance, LULAC, the Center for Responsible Lending, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the list goes on. When groups like these all stand together on an issue, you know it carries some serious weight. So where does all this leave us? Well, the deal is on the table. The opposition has laid out its arguments loud and clear. And now the whole thing is basically in limbo, just waiting for a decision. But before we get to that, let's make sure we hear the government's side of the story. For its part, the Department of Justice is standing firm. They're defending the deal. Assistant Attorney General Harmeet K. Gillen put out a statement saying the settlement will, quote, promote public safety and affordable and sustainable home ownership in America, key priorities of this administration. So from their perspective, the infrastructure money and the enforcement funding are all necessary pieces of a bigger, more complete solution. But at the end of the day, neither the advocacy groups nor the government gets the final word here. The fate of this entire $68 million deal now rests with a single federal judge in Texas. That judge has to weigh the government's reasoning against the incredibly strong objections from this coalition and make a call on whether this deal really, truly serves justice. And that really leaves all of us with a huge, critical question to think about. What does true justice for victims of predatory lending actually look like? Is it enough to just stop the bad guy and throw some money at infrastructure? Or does real justice demand direct help for the people who were hurt? And, maybe most importantly, a guarantee that the solution doesn't create a brand new, even scarier problem for the very people it was meant to save? That's the question the court has to answer. And it's one we should probably all be thinking about too.